Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our hope. Amen. I'm not sure where to stand because I want to read something later. Earlier I was saying, just a few minutes ago, I was saying how I am Jesus, and we were talking about you all are Jesus. Last night, Lori and I were playing crib, and I did not have good cards. And if you were to ask her, I was very definitely not being Jesus. I was like swearing up a storm and everything. The thing is, it's even the life of Jesus isn't that smooth. But there are moments, aren't there? And that's kind of what we have this morning. We have moments. And they are moments in which Jesus is revealed, I guess. I mean, the story in John is way more complicated, and there's all sorts of little tidbits and things that we could Bible study to death. It would be great. But I don't think that's the point of hearing that story with the story of Saul on the road to Damascus. They're both stories of an experience of Jesus. And I think we generally tend to want to experience Jesus like Saul. Something flashy, a big moment, rather than something simple that actually questions who we are before it directs us anywhere else. We call that story, first of all, let me say, we call that story about Saul, we call it the conversion. In fact, if you look up the festival date, which I want to say is either in January or June, I can't remember which, on the church calendar, it's the conversion of St. Paul. But it's Saul. And traditionally, we've used that distinction as a way of showing, used to be Saul, now is Paul. So before we go any further, let's clear that up. Or intentionally muddy the waters, as the case may be. Saul and Paul are the same word. They're the same name. Saul is the Jewish, the Hebrew version of the word, and Paul would be the Romanized version. So it makes perfectly logical sense that while Saul was in Judea, or around Jerusalem, and he was with his Jewish family and part of the Jewish faith, that everyone would call him Saul. As he traveled around the Mediterranean, the Romanized Mediterranean, controlled by the Roman Empire, he would have been called Paul. So, if you think the distinction is Saul, Shazam, Paul, that isn't how it works. If you think Saul bad, Paul good, and the hinge in that is Jesus going, Shazam! Sorry, here's the thing about Saul. We traditionally picture Saul as the bad guy. He's evil because he's going around rounding up followers of Jesus. Except Saul was a devout Jew, a very traditional devout Jew, who worked for the synagogue. He worked for the high priests and the authorities in the synagogue. And his job was to find those heretics who were hurting our faith and our traditions by talking about this Jesus fella and bring them back so we can put them out of the way. We don't need to go into the what out of the way is, but as far as Saul was concerned, he was doing the right thing. He was doing an important job. It was important work. They were probably thinking that in the Middle Ages when they burned people at the stake too. But the point is, Saul wasn't as evil as we think. It's just that the lens through which he saw his faith was all about protecting the traditions in the synagogue and making sure that the church was, Freudian slip, was kept protected and safe. And the lens through which Jesus sees everything, of course, is love. So Saul wasn't a bad guy. As far as the Jewish community was concerned, he was a really good guy. It's just that he let that belief in how important it was to protect the institution and the religion, he let that turn to hate. I'll just pause for a minute while you think about the church. Right? Because that does happen all the time. This is a moment where that cartoon from The Naked Pastor that I used last week comes into play. It's one of my favorites, where he says to all of the people holding their Bibles, it's just that, you see the world through, or love through the lens of the Bible, and I see the Bible through the lens of love, right? This is Jesus. So Saul meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, in a story in which there's a flash of light and the voice of Jesus is heard saying, "I'm Jesus," to which Saul replied, "No," and went on his way. That isn't how the story goes, is it? We kind of stopped reading before we get into the part where he goes on into Damascus, and because of the bright light through which he saw Jesus, he's blinded for 3 days. And then Ananias, a devout follower of Jesus, he's referred to as a disciple, in fact, has a vision of Jesus in which Jesus says, "Go and see this guy and tell him what he needs to do. And then you heal him and he'll be able to see again." And Ananias, of course, goes, "No." Because he knows who Saul is. Ananias basically went, "I ain't doing that. I know what this guy has been doing to us." And Jesus says, "Nope, he's the guy. Go." So Ananias does, and then Paul goes off into his ministry and is instantly praised as the greatest follower of Jesus. No, he isn't. He's not accepted right away, of course. Why? Because of what he'd been doing before. But he's Jesus-y, so they learn to believe him. Oh, I totally should have gone with he was doing good Jesusing, shouldn't I? But that's how they learned to believe in him. We tell this story like Saul bad, Paul good. Flash of light, he's changed by Jesus. But that isn't what happened. What happened was Jesus offered him grace. Jesus didn't go, "Shazam, you are changed." He offered Saul the grace of a space, a time in which to choose. Do I continue to hate in order to protect this tradition and institution that I have loved? Or do I love and let go of these laws and rules and things that have been holding me back from loving? There are numerous stories of Jesus appearing to the disciples after the resurrection. The one that we heard this morning, this one in John, comes from the 21st chapter of John, which, by the way, is generally considered to be an add-on. Because if you read the end of chapter 20, it kind of ends like, okay, we're done, but then there's more. And I think one of the reasons there's more is because somebody thought it would be a really good idea to point out how important it is to offer grace. That Jesus isn't magic. that makes you different. Jesus simply offers you the grace to choose. And so here's this story that, and there's lots in this story. We read all of it, so there's tons of stuff to get out of it. So let's just cut to the chase. At the end of this story, Jesus has a conversation with the biblical character we know as Peter. And we know Peter as Peter because that's the name Jesus gives him. It means the rock, and the rock on which I will build my church, right? But that's not what Jesus calls him in this story. He sits down with Peter and he calls him Simon, his given name. And he asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" Just take a moment to think about why Jesus would ask him that question 3 times. Doesn't it remind you of earlier in the story when Peter denies Jesus? Peter denies Jesus 3 times. So 3 times Jesus asks him, "Do you love me?" And that's not just reminding him, but us, of how he denied him 3 times. The character Simon, who Jesus was so firmly convinced was going to be great, he called him Peter, denies Jesus. So Jesus reminds him, not to remind him of his failure, but to remind him that here is a moment in which you are offered grace to choose, to feed my sheep, to care for my sheep, to follow me. See, I think this is a great moment when Jesus says, "Follow me," because you don't know whether Jesus said, "Follow me," or "Follow me." In other words, is Jesus saying, "Follow me, be me, do me," or "Come after me to show everyone me. Go and do it now"? You have a choice. Are you going to stick with being that guy who said, "I don't know him," 3 times because you were afraid? Or are you going to be courageous enough to say, "I am Jesus," and go and be that in the world? Both Saul and Simon have a choice, and they have that choice because Jesus offers them grace in which to make it. Not the grace just of forgiveness, but the grace of a moment of space, of time in which to make that choice. We're offered that too. But because we are offered that, should we choose to be Jesus, we also choose to offer it to others. So if you want to say, "I am Jesus," it's not just a question of being the Jesus that we see do kindness and share love with others. It's the Jesus who offers grace to people. It's Jesus who offers grace to people who have said or done hurtful things. Love your enemy. Okay, that's tricky. But not so much if you consider it just simply offering a moment of grace. Who is my neighbor? Well, everyone is my neighbor. Well, how do I get to know my neighbor? Offer them the grace to tell their story so that you can hear it and get to know them. Be curious about other people and find out more. How do you do that? You offer them the grace of space in which to tell their story, and you listen. I'm Jesus when I do that. I'm Jesus when I offer moments of love and care. I'm Jesus when I reach out to the poor and the sick, stand up for injustice. I'm Jesus when I offer the grace to others that is offered to me. so that we might learn and know and understand and make Jesus-y choices. I'm just coming up with new things. But that's the thing about these stories. That's what they have in common. It's not a moment in which Jesus makes anyone anything. And that often is how we tend to come to Jesus. We want Jesus to make us more. But you have a part to play in that, because Jesus simply offers grace in which to choose to be more. The last little while, I've started to follow a poet that I found just accidentally on Facebook, who's weirdly from Wyoming. I don't know why I said weirdly, but is from Wyoming. John Rodell. Does anyone else come across John Rodell? I hope I'm saying his last name correctly. And I found these words that he'd written just a couple of weeks ago. Oh, Jesus, give me better eyesight. Okay. He did. Tonight I sat with a question as if it were my child. Maybe it was. It took its time. Then the question whispered itself into form. What if this is all I am? I almost turned away, but didn't. The question became three blackbirds, then flew away. The silence took me inside of myself, and in that soft stillness, 7 holy words rose off my tongue like winter melt steam. I am not afraid of becoming more. I think sometimes we spend a lot of time reminding ourselves and each other that you are enough, just as you are. We talk about how to welcome like Jesus is to welcome people just as they are. Absolutely. That is absolutely being Jesus. But so is offering them the grace to be more. Because we grow, don't we? We grow, we change, we learn. We learn because we are alive. And as we live, we become more. That's the grace that God offers us. Not just the grace of forgiveness, but the grace to be more.